Oh my, she's sleeping so soundly. My mother-in-law murmured to my daughter who was dozing off in the back seat, as she parked the car in the outlet mall parking lot. When she turned off the engine, the air conditioning went off too, and the temperature inside the car soared under the scorching sun. My daughter's face turned red, and sweat started to bead on her forehead. Observing this, she gave a creepy grin, stepped out of the car alone, locked it, and went shopping. My name is Olivia, a 31-year-old office worker. I live with my husband Matthew, our daughter Emma, and my in-laws. My in-laws are my quiet father-in-law, James, and my cantankerous mother-in-law Linda. When we got married, my husband mentioned that he wanted us to live with his parents. His father has mobility issues and requires regular medical visits. Since my mother-in-law is not comfortable driving, my husband has been supporting them by living at their house. I deeply respect my kind-hearted husband. Having grown up with my paternal grandparents, I had no qualms about living in a 3-generation household. However, 5 years ago, when we started living with my in-laws, I realized my assumptions were naive. My mother-in-law is incredibly short-tempered and extremely stingy. She secretly harassed me, earning her the nickname, the Wicked Mother-in-Law. She was nothing like my grandmother, with whom I had a harmonious relationship. While I don't know how she treated her daughter-in-law behind closed doors, my grandmother and my mother seemed to get along well. Consequently, I couldn't fathom the real-life battles between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law seen on TV. I used to think, almost as if it were someone else's problem, that there are people going through difficult times. But living with my in-laws shattered my preconceptions. The harassment from my mother-in-law began on day 1. She declared, "Since you've stepped into our home, you'll follow all our customs." As a result, I was burdened with all household chores, including preparing meals for my in-laws, cleaning the entire house, providing transportation for hospital visits and outings, and having good relationships with neighbors. Any deviation from my mother-in-law's wishes resulted in later complaints. Desperate to please her, I closely observed her methods and mimicked them. Whenever I tried to enjoy my free time, she would hover behind me, monitoring my every move. My husband, unaware of her true nature, often praised our harmonious relationship. "It's wonderful how well you and Olivia get along," he'd say. We'd both respond with forced smiles. My frequent interactions with neighbors, as per my mother-in-law's orders, led to an increase in acquaintances. Sympathetic neighbors would say, "Isn't your mother-in-law strict and difficult?" Apparently, her wickedness was well known in the neighborhood. Rumor had it that my husband's previous girlfriends had also faced her harassment. Despite being handsome and kind, my husband's undesirable mother made him less appealing to other women. As someone who hadn't known these circumstances, I felt uneasy when I first heard about them. But my father-in-law treated me well, and the real issue was my mother-in-law. If I could endure her harassment, perhaps we could maintain a peaceful life, or so I thought. Her harassment escalated when my pregnancy was confirmed. Initially, she seemed happy when I shared the news, but the moment she learned it was a girl, her expression turned blatantly disapproving. She said, "Having a girl means she'll eventually leave. She's not worth raising. Quickly, have a boy." I retorted, "Every child born is precious. Besides, we're not obligated to pass on the family business, right? So there's no need to fixate on having a boy." In response, my mother-in-law continued, "Our family has been landowners for generations. Our surname is special. I won't allow our lineage to break because of you." She huffed indignantly. Honestly, I didn't marry for social status. My husband wasn't concerned about having an heir. In fact, knowing we were having a girl, he eagerly anticipated our daughter's arrival, thinking of toys and celebrating her birth. To him, she was the long-awaited girl. While my mother-in-law grumbled about our daughter, she never directly begged my husband for a son, only when we were alone. In secret, she insisted I produce a son. Her attitude persisted even after our daughter was born. In front of my husband and father-in-law, she doted on our daughter, but when our daughter sought comfort from her, especially on bad days, my mother-in-law would coldly push her away. It was clear she didn't genuinely care for our daughter. Grandma is scary. As our daughter grew and began speaking, she started avoiding my mother-in-law, One day, my husband noticed this behavior and confronted his mother. "Emma seems afraid of you. You're not treating her poorly, are you?" Panicked at being exposed, my mother-in-law changed her approach. From then on, she actively took our daughter to the park and cared for her at home. However, her harassment toward me intensified. I had grown accustomed to her petty remarks and no longer felt hurt by them. Most importantly, her improved behavior toward our daughter put my mind at ease. As our daughter gradually warmed up to her, I decided to return to work. My husband adjusted his schedule, allowing our daughter to stay with my mother-in-law for a few hours during weekdays. Surprisingly, my father-in-law was thrilled to look after our daughter. Perhaps he influenced my mother-in-law, who reluctantly agreed to care for our daughter. One weekend, an emergency situation arose at work, and I was ordered to work on my day off. Starting now? Understood. I'll head there right away. As I anxiously spoke into the phone, my mother-in-law must have sensed that it was a call from my workplace. She gave me a stern look. My husband had already gone to work, having swapped shifts with a colleague that day. My father-in-law had left early to attend his mentor's son's wedding. I considered finding a temporary place to leave my daughter, Emma, but doing so on the same day seemed impossible. Leaving Emma alone at home for an extended period isn't an option. I need my mother-in-law to look after her, I thought to myself. Just then, my mother-in-law abruptly addressed me. "Don't worry. I'll take Emma to the outlet mall. You go to work. Grandma, let's go." My daughter was overjoyed. I hadn't expected my mother-in-law to volunteer to take care of Emma, so I was pleasantly surprised. After thanking her repeatedly, I reminded Emma to listen to her grandmother. I hurriedly made my way to the office. However, that afternoon, I received an unbelievable phone call. It was the police. He said in a reassuring tone. "Please stay calm. We've taken care of your daughter." Unexpectedly, Emma had been trapped inside a car, but someone found her and rescued her. "Please come to the outlet mall's office immediately." What's going on? If she's being protected, Emma must be safe. I regained my composure and tried to understand the situation. What's she doing now? I couldn't reach my mother-in-law, she wasn't answering her phone. Upon arriving at the outlet mall, I headed for the employee entrance. After explaining the situation to the security guard, I was allowed inside. In a room, several police officers stood around a pipe chair, where my little daughter sat. Emma noticed me and jumped off the chair, running toward me. "Mom." She had been anxious, surrounded by unfamiliar adults, and was crying uncontrollably. Meanwhile, I held her tightly, relieved to see her safe. Although it wasn't midsummer, the direct sunlight was scorching. Children's body temperatures are higher than adults, and leaving Emma in the car was unthinkable. If no one had found her, Emma would have been in serious trouble. Imagining the worst, I trembled. I hugged Emma once more. Despite repeatedly calling my mother-in-law, there was still no response. I need to hear the details from her directly, I thought, suspicious of her. I explained to the police that my mother-in-law had been looking after Emma. However, when Emma was discovered, my mother-in-law was nowhere to be found. I became convinced that my mother-in-law intentionally left Emma in the car. Emma couldn't unbuckle her seatbelt or open the car door by herself. If someone hadn't helped her, Emma would have been in serious danger. My anger toward my mother-in-law flared up again. Was she still inside the mall? Let's search the entire store. If we don't find her, we'll head home, I decided. To keep Emma entertained, I bought her juice while we continued our search. The police officer also offered to help, so I thanked them and left the room. Glancing at my phone, I noticed a reply to the email I'd sent my husband 30 minutes earlier. Despite its many mistakes and half-coherent content, it was clear that my husband was quite upset. In my email, I conveyed that our daughter was safe, explained that I would search for my mother-in-law, and requested that he wait at home after work. I didn't want our daughter to see us both upset. For now, I would focus on finding my mother-in-law. We wandered through the store, Emma growing bored. Meanwhile, my shopping-loving mother-in-law disliked driving herself and frequently invited me to accompany her, often on the same day. She would spontaneously decide to go out, causing me to rearrange my existing plans. However, my mother-in-law never expressed an ounce of gratitude for my efforts to adjust my schedule. Oblivious to my concerns, she enjoyed shopping at her own pace. On days like today, when my husband and father-in-law were absent, our daughter joined us. The outlet mall, with its many temptations, became a playground for her whims. Buy this. Buy that. Her demands escalated. Despite having experienced parenthood herself, my mother-in-law seemed baffled by our daughter's behavior. She watched me struggle with a crying child, yet continued shopping at her leisure for 2 or 3 hours. Frustrated by her selfishness, I considered leaving her behind. But then, my mother-in-law exclaimed, "My daughter-in-law abandoned me." She tearfully appealed to the security guard nearby. Although this incident was in the past, recalling it still irritated me. This same self-centered mother-in-law had put our daughter in harm's way today. I can't stay silent about this. I must find my mother-in-law. Determined, I scrutinized the faces of passers-by. Suddenly, our daughter pointed and shouted, "There's Grandma." I turned to see my mother-in-law, who appeared surprised by my sudden movement. She let out an awkward sound and swiftly changed direction, running away. "Wait, Linda." She headed toward the parking lot, and I chased after her. Fortunately, the weekend outlet mall was bustling with people, making it impossible for her to escape easily. I never lost sight of her. The mother-in-law seemed to be heading toward her car. I followed her. Just as the car came into view, she noticed something was wrong. She exclaimed, "What is this?" with a terrified expression. To our surprise, the rear window had been shattered, and shards of glass were scattered on the ground. Accusingly, she turned to me and grabbed my collar. "You did this," she accused. I stood my ground, my anger matching hers. "It wasn't me," I retorted. "If it wasn't you, then who would do such a thing? Stop making excuses and compensate immediately," she demanded. Frustrated, I shot back. "In this scorching heat, leaving young Emma alone in the car while you went somewhere, aren't you the one at fault?" I continued. "Do you not know about the news of children left in cars who tragically lost their lives?" My boldness surprised her. I usually behave modestly. As we argued, bystanders gathered, observing our heated exchange. Realizing she was being watched, she hurriedly got into her car. "Remember this. You'll definitely pay for this," she declared before speeding away. The window glass fell to the ground in a cascade. "This is dangerous," I thought. Just then, a police officer stopped her car. Out of breath, the officer seemed to have sprinted here. My mother-in-law's expression froze, her earlier determination vanished. She followed the officer's instructions, parking the car in the designated spot. As she stepped out, several officers escorted her away. "Emma and her mother, please come with us," the officer instructed. We followed, wondering what would happen next. Until a moment ago, my daughter was sitting in the pipe chair, but now my mother-in-law is sitting there. My daughter seems completely at ease, still asleep in my arms. "Why did you leave your granddaughter in the car?" One of the police officers calmly and sternly questions my mother-in-law. "Never mind that. My car window was broken. If you're the police, catch the culprit. It's probably this woman's doing," my mother-in-law retorts defiantly, pointing at me and glaring at the officer. "No, that's not true. Emma's mother didn't break the window. Another customer noticed that she was left inside the car and broke the window to rescue her." Huh? As the police officer explains, my mother-in-law looks surprised, mouth agape. When a couple was getting out of the car to go shopping, they heard Emma crying. They worked together to break the window and rescue Emma. Afterward, they promptly reported it to us. The officer continues to explain about the person who broke the car window. They also mentioned that Emma's body temperature was still relatively normal, considering the time she was left behind. Thanks to that, we were able to respond quickly. We found her mother's contact information from Emma's belongings and immediately reached out to you. Hearing this, tears welled up in my eyes. If those people hadn't noticed Emma, what would have happened to her? But my mother-in-law remains unyielding. I often go shopping alone, you know? So, I just forgot that I had Emma with me. With a feigned expression, my mother-in-law continues. As soon as I realized Emma wasn't there, I tried to go back to the car. But then this woman was holding Emma, and to top it off, my car window was broken. I naturally assumed it was her doing. The police respond to my mother-in-law's blatant lies. Ma'am, please stop lying. There's evidence on the dashcam. When you got out of the car, you spoke to your granddaughter, then closed the curtain and hid the rear seat. It's all recorded. My mother-in-law's expression momentarily darkens. Why are you watching that kind of thing? It's an invasion of privacy. Just because you're the police doesn't mean you can get away with it. She slams her hand on the table. The loud noise wakes up my daughter, so I step out for a moment. Even through the thick walls, I can still hear my mother-in-law's shouting. According to the police, the dashcam even recorded my mother-in-law leaning toward the sleeping daughter, saying, "Sleep well, Emma." Given the decisive evidence that remains, it's unlikely that my mother-in-law will escape guilt. After being questioned by the police for a while, my mother-in-law finally reached her limit. It's because that woman gave birth to a girl. We need a boy in our family. She finally confessed the reason for leaving our daughter behind in the car. At that time, we were already back home, so I heard this story later from the police. My shock was immense upon hearing my mother-in-law's true feelings toward our daughter. If I had been there, I might have confronted her without caring about the onlookers. Unfortunately, the chance for revenge against my mother-in-law never came. Why? Because right after that statement, she was taken into custody by the police. She was charged with child abandonment, and her prison sentence was decided. Even now, with the conviction, my mother-in-law stubbornly refuses to go to prison. But unless she changes her feelings toward our daughter, we won't cross paths after she serves her sentence. When I informed my husband, he and my father-in-law both expressed the same opinion. My father-in-law hired a lawyer and presented my mother-in-law with divorce papers. My husband, furious that our daughter had been endangered, declared a complete estrangement from his mother. Left to her own devices after being pushed away by my husband and father-in-law, my mother-in-law wrote letters to all our relatives, pleading for help. But given the gravity of her crime, no one extended a helping hand. After her release, she'll likely spend the rest of her life alone. News of the incident caused quite a stir in the neighborhood, prompting us to decide to move. My father-in-law said, "My wife did something terrible. I apologize for burdening you." He covered the moving expenses from his savings. Meanwhile, my father-in-law sold the house he had lived in for years and decided to live alone near us. My father-in-law said, "Life is just beginning, and I'll enjoy a peaceful, solitary existence." His face seemed somewhat relieved. 6 months after moving, we settled into our new home. It was during this time that we discovered I was pregnant with our second child. Freed from my mother-in-law's harassment, we could finally lead a calm life. And the gender of our second child? A boy. But for my husband and me, the child's gender doesn't matter. Our daughter, observing my growing belly, eagerly anticipates having a little brother. She says, "As I'm going to be a big sister soon, I'll help Mom." Her enthusiasm warms my heart. Our nearby father-in-law is also eagerly awaiting the birth of our second child. Knowing he'll continue to care for our children gives us great comfort. From now on, as a family of 4, along with my father-in-law, we hope to lead a happy and peaceful life.
I have to take food to Mommy.
With those words, my grandchild, who was hospitalized for pediatric cancer, left the hospital. Despite being only 7 years old, she had bravely endured her painful treatments without complaint. Upon hearing her words, I hurried to my son's house. But when I arrived, it wasn't my runaway grandchild I found, but my frail daughter-in-law. Why? I gasped at the sight before me. To my shock, she was pulling weeds from the garden and eating them. When she revealed an unbelievable truth, I made a firm decision in my heart. My husband Jason had just retired, and we were enjoying a leisurely life together. To supplement our income, I started a home vegetable garden, which grew to the point where I was considered an expert. It became a daily routine for us to work in the garden together, and when we had a bountiful harvest, we shared our vegetables with our neighbors. The joy they expressed over the delicious vegetables I grew was a source of motivation. Our only son, John, married Amy when he was 27. He met her at the company where he worked, which was run by her father. A year later, a lovely baby girl named Emma was born. Though we didn't live together, our family gatherings were always filled with smiles around our grandchild. From any perspective, we seemed like a happy family. We had no typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflicts. In fact, I had a very good relationship with Amy. John and Amy often visited with Emma, and I cherished watching my first grandchild grow, feeling grateful for these moments. When Emma was about 6 years old, she fell ill. Despite visiting several hospitals, her condition didn't improve, so she was hospitalized for a thorough examination. The tests revealed that she had pediatric cancer. Our family hoped it was a mistake, but it was an undeniable reality.
I'm okay. I'll do my best. So everyone, please support me.
While everyone around her was in shock, Emma remained strong and composed. That's right. You're a strong girl, and you'll definitely get better. I decided to support her with a positive attitude. Emma endured the repeated painful treatments without complaining, bravely fighting her illness. My son and daughter-in-law also supported and encouraged her. Let's do everything we can to help them. My husband and I agreed to focus on supporting our son and his family. Amy, are you okay? Are you getting enough rest?
Yes, somehow. But every time the phone rings, I worry that something might have happened to Emma.
I understand. It's worrying. Amy visited the hospital daily and stayed with Emma as much as possible during her prolonged hospitalization. Her face showed clear signs of exhaustion. Why don't you take a break and let John take over for a bit? I'm worried about your health too.
Yes, but...
According to Amy, my son had become too busy with work to visit the hospital. Emma knew about this and seemed somewhat lonely because of it. Seeing her like this broke my heart. I decided to call John. I thought Amy might be holding back and enduring a lot due to her reserved nature. Emma and Amy are doing their best. Can't you help out a bit more?
What? Are you saying I'm not doing anything?
I didn't say that. But could you visit them even for a short time? Thinking of them, I spoke more firmly than usual.
I know, but the treatment costs a lot. I have to work overtime to pay for it.
He responded in a tired voice. After ending the call, I shared the conversation with Jason. The next day, I asked John to come over because we had something important to discuss. He arrived after 11 p.m., reflecting how tough his situation was. Your father and I have decided to help. This isn't much, but please use it for Emma's treatment. We decided to provide some financial assistance, hoping it would allow John to spend more time with his family.
Thank you. This really helps. But please don't tell Amy about this.
Okay, but why?
I don't want her to worry about money.
Understanding his concern for his family, we agreed to keep this a secret. However, Amy later told us that John was still too busy to visit the hospital often, although he promised. What worried me more than John's absence was Amy's condition. She looked exhausted, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes, and seemed constantly dazed. Amy, why don't you take a few days to rest at home? I'll take care of Emma. I suggested this out of concern for her well-being. Despite this, Amy insisted on continuing her dedicated care. Then one day, Amy suddenly stopped coming to the hospital. Your mom isn't coming today either?
Dad said she caught a cold. She also wrote me a letter, but I feel too tired to read it right now.
Emma seemed visibly weak, likely affected by not seeing her mother daily. John's visit to the hospital brought some relief, but I still worried about Amy. Is Amy really okay? Should I come over to help? I called John and asked.
She's fine. But if you catch her cold, no one will be able to visit Emma. Please don't come to the house.
He was firm, and I realized he was right. If we all got sick, it would be a disaster, especially if Emma caught it. So, I decided not to visit. Instead, I sent Amy an email. I'll keep you updated daily about Emma's condition. However, there was no reply from her, indicating she was likely feeling very unwell. A few days later, I received a call from the hospital on my phone. Did something happen to Emma? My heart skipped a beat, but I knew I had to stay calm. Taking a deep breath, I answered the call. The hospital informed me that Emma had left the hospital and was nowhere to be found. They couldn't reach her parents, so they called me as the emergency contact. Luckily, I was already preparing to visit, so I had my husband drive us to the hospital immediately. Once there, I found the nurse who usually attended to Emma and learned that Emma had disappeared after lunch, saying she needed to take food to her mom. You search around the hospital. I asked Jason to do this while I drove to my son and daughter-in-law's house. What if something happened to Emma? This thought kept racing through my mind, making the drive unbearable. When I arrived at the house, the front door was locked, and there was no response when I rang the doorbell. I walked around to the backyard and found Amy sitting on the lawn. Amy. Something terrible has happened. I called out to her as I approached, but she didn't respond. She had her back to me, and I couldn't see what she was doing. When I got in front of her, I was shocked and speechless. Amy, looking emaciated, was pulling up and eating grass from the yard. Why? I was at a loss for words, unable to comprehend what was happening. But I couldn't just stand there. Amy. Amy. Can you hear me? I kept calling her name until she finally responded, looking at me.
Nancy.
I brought Amy inside and listened to her story.
Actually.
What she told me was so astonishing that I couldn't believe my ears. At that moment, I received a call from my husband saying they had found Emma. She had run out of energy on her way home and was sitting on a bench a bit away from the hospital. Can you contact the hospital and take her back? Also, tell her that her mom is okay. When I told Amy that Emma was safe, she started to cry tears of relief. I comforted her and decided to call my son. After a few rings, he answered in a slightly annoyed tone.
Yes. What is it?
Ignoring his attitude, I explained what had happened with Emma.
Amy has a severe cold, and I'm on a business trip, so I'll leave it to you, Mom.
You can't talk like that. Come home immediately. This is about your daughter. Angered by his cold response, I snapped back.
I have important work. I can't leave my clients.
John listed excuses and abruptly ended the call. I felt a deep, simmering anger not only about Emma but also because John had lied about Amy's condition. I won't forgive this. Before doing anything else, I needed to get Amy to the hospital. So, I called an ambulance. After she received care, I started preparing for what needed to be done next. I made a call to a certain place. 3 days later, I was waiting for my son outside his workplace as he finished his shift.
Mom? What are you doing here?
He asked. John, you're not working overtime today? I called out to him as he came out almost exactly on time and slowly approached me. He looked quite annoyed and seemed reluctant to even talk to me. There's a cafe nearby that Amy said has amazing coffee. I want to try it, so will you come with me?
What? No way. I have a lot of things to do. Maybe some other time.
I have something important to discuss. Come on, let's go. I grabbed his arm firmly and headed to the cafe. Inside, it was bustling with groups of office workers and housewives finishing their day. John let out a big sigh as soon as we sat down.
What are you up to, suddenly showing up and dragging me here? If you have something to say, just say it already.
All right, I'll get straight to the point. When Emma ran away from the hospital, why didn't you come immediately? I looked him in the eye as I asked.
It's not like I could help it. I was on a business trip. I couldn't just leave.
John started tapping the table with his nails in frustration. Oh. I heard you had taken a day off.
What?
I asked with a bit of sarcasm, and he looked bewildered. He clearly didn't expect me to know that. I called your company and asked. Was that wrong?
Why would you do that? Everyone is busy, and you're bothering them.
John leaned forward, frowning, and started speaking rapidly. Ignoring his attitude, I took a sip of water. What were you doing on your day off? Is there something more important than your own daughter?
That's none of your business.
With that, he turned away like a child. I then took a photo out of my bag and showed it to him. Were you on a trip with this woman?
What? How do you have that?
John asked, his eyes wide with shock. The photo showed John walking closely with a woman. Yes, he was having an affair. It probably started around the time Emma's illness was diagnosed, and the money we gave him was likely spent on her. The constant overtime was a complete lie. And here is proof of your trip. I took my phone from the table and showed him a screen. Look, you're clearly in the picture.
Wait, what is this?
What I showed him were pictures from his mistress's social media. They were holding hands and smiling broadly at the camera during their trip.
Why do you have these, Mom?
Amy originally found the photos, and you've seen those before, right? The social media posts, I tracked down myself. Actually, my daughter-in-law Amy had secretly started investigating John's infidelity on her own some time ago. She confronted him with all the gathered evidence. But you blew up at her when she showed you, didn't you? Then you started treating her horribly and even began to restrict her movements," I said. John snapped.
How much do you know? Did you go to the house and meet her? I told you not to go.
Your excuse about her being sick was a lie, I replied calmly to my son, who was desperately trying to argue back. The day my granddaughter escaped from the hospital, Amy confided in me about John's outrageous behavior, and I was shocked. I didn't want to believe that my own son not only cheated but also mistreated Amy. Amy said that John had been unapologetic about the affair. When she tried to divorce him and demanded alimony, he refused. To silence her, he physically abused her, restricted her from going out, confiscated her phone, and even deprived her of food. The claim that she was sick was just a lie to keep us from contacting each other. Amy was eating grass in the yard. She was that desperate, I revealed.
What? She did that? Unbelievable.
He sneered, mocking her actions. She was covered in bruises and diagnosed with malnutrition. I continued, sharing what the doctor had told me at the hospital, but John seemed indifferent and played with his phone. Do you realize you're doing something utterly despicable? I asked, my voice filled with contempt.
I can't get divorced. It would ruin my standing at the company. I'm supposed to take over someday.
He replied, smirking as he looked up from his phone. Since Amy's father is the company's president, John likely thought any scandal, such as his affair, would be a massive problem.
I made sure she didn't meet anyone to avoid her spilling the beans.
He added, grinning. Moreover, John had threatened her, saying, if you run away, I won't pay for Emma's hospital bills or let her get treatment. Amy, increasingly cornered, ultimately decided to comply for the sake of their child. Thinking about Amy's plight breaks my heart. John said,
Why did you go to the house, anyway?
Because your precious daughter escaped from the hospital, I replied.
Then you should have looked around the hospital.
He retorted. She left saying she had to bring food to her mom, I explained. John looked puzzled and confused.
But Emma shouldn't know about her mother's situation since she's been in the hospital.
He said. That's true, normally, I agreed, handing him a piece of paper. It was a letter Amy had written to her daughter.
What's this supposed to prove? There's nothing unusual in here.
He argued. The letter seemed ordinary at first glance, but it held a hidden message. What do you think happens if you read only the first letters of each line vertically? I asked. John took the letter, scanning it carefully. After deciphering it, he slammed the table in anger. Tell Grandma to help me. It hurts. I'm hungry. This was an SOS from Amy, I explained. Emma read this and escaped to bring lunch to her mom, I added, but John still seemed confused.
But she hadn't visited her mother for a while. How could she have delivered such a letter?
He protested. It appears you delivered it to the hospital, I said.
What?
He exclaimed. Amy had given John an envelope with documents for the hospital, including the letter for Emma. He had been too preoccupied with his affair to remember. After thinking for a moment, John realized.
How cunning. But how did you decode it?
It was a game Amy invented for Emma to enjoy while bedridden, I explained. Emma, weakened by her treatment, spent most of her days in bed. Decoding letters was a detective game they enjoyed together. The nurses and doctors knew about it. The only one who didn't was you, because you never visited, I said, staring at John. He scowled and made a loud, annoyed sound.
Give me a break. It's her fault for having a sick child. She's a failure as a woman.
He shouted. How can you say that? I responded, horrified.
That's why it's okay to cheat on her.
He continued without hesitation. His cruel words made me lose all patience and affection for him. I wondered where I had gone wrong in raising my son. All I felt was regret, knowing that Amy had suffered because of it. The only way I could atone was to ensure he faced the consequences of his actions. I've told Amy's father everything about your affair, her hospitalization, and the reasons behind it, I said.
What? No. That can't be true.
John began to panic. It is. Don't think you can do such terrible things and get away with it unscathed.
What am I supposed to do? As my mother, can't you consider my position at the company?
Think about how foolish you've been. I snapped. I placed the divorce papers Amy had given me in front of him. Seeing them, John finally seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions, and sweat began to form on his forehead.
Mom, help me! Please apologize to Amy and the president with me.
He pleaded, still hoping for a way out. But life isn't that easy. Stop relying on your parents. Take responsibility for your own actions, I said firmly. This was the final lesson I could teach him, and I pushed him away. He collapsed onto the table, sobbing. Later, the divorce was finalized. Amy demanded $20,000 in alimony, $10,000 from the other woman, $70,000 in child support paid up front, and $30,000 for emotional distress. John sold his house and took on debt to pay these amounts. It turned out that the other woman was a coworker, and both were transferred to different departments for disrupting workplace conduct. Coincidentally, someone from John's company was at the cafe where we talked, and the news of his affair spread. They both eventually resigned due to the hostile work environment. We cut ties with John. After several attempts to seek help from us, he eventually stopped coming, and we have no idea what happened to him. Amy recovered and was discharged from the hospital. Our granddaughter is doing well with her treatment and is expected to come home soon. We still keep in touch with Amy and our granddaughter, and I'm determined to support and watch over them. How did you find this story? Please subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.